We are go.
Order. I'll call to order today's Defence Committee hearing session on the UK's contribution to European security as part of our ongoing inquiry. It gives me great pleasure to welcome again Dr. Robert Johnson. Thank you, Dr. Johnson, for coming to give evidence. Dr. Johnson is the former Director of the Secretary of State's Office of Net Assessment and Challenge, and he is also the Director of the Strategy, Statecraft and Technology Research Centre at Pembroke College at the University of Oxford. We're very much looking forward to getting your evidence on record today, Dr. Johnson. And without further ado, let me introduce my colleague Derek Twigg to kick us off with the questioning.
Dr. Johnson, welcome. Can I start by asking you about the ability of the UK to meet its commitments to NATO? And if we can sort of put a little bit of background to this, because those of us who have been on the committee a fairly long time, when we questioned the ability of the UK to be able to put, for instance, a division out and talked about what it could deliver to NATO, we've often been told, yes, we can do X, Y and Z, but don't forget we are part of NATO and therefore they will always cover the bits we haven't got. Yeah. I sort of paraphrase, but roughly that's what we get told time and time again. So against that sort of balance, so basically the question is, what about our gaps in terms of ability? We also know that NATO has its own capability gaps. So maybe you could just talk to us about that first?
Yes, certainly. Thank you very much indeed. And thank you very much indeed for the invitation and the opportunity to speak with you. And thank you also for serving on this very, very important committee. There's always a risk, isn't there, that a specialist comes along with a special interest. And I think, sometimes a bit of special pleading sometimes comes out as well. I will be as forthright and accurate as I can in my answer. But you're absolutely right to say that across Europe at the moment, there is the same problem. It's almost as if everyone is looking at everyone else, expecting them to come along and provide the support. I was recently at a conference organised in the Netherlands, and the representatives there of the UK, France, Germany, the United States, and the Netherlands, of course, itself, and one or two other nations like Poland. And it was very evident that there was a great deal of anxiety about the UK not providing the military, naval and air leadership that all of them felt that the UK, as a permanent member of the Security Council, a nuclear armed power, should be providing. One of the Americans there, I won't name names, was quite categorical that the UK is not a tier one military power in the way that its armed forces are currently configured. But they were all looking at each other, concerned that they don't have the critical enablers in places like space or electronic warfare or intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance. And all had worked on the assumption, as I think we have in the UK, that if anything really serious happens, the rest of NATO would come along and provide those supports and facilities. And statistically, I know members of the committee will know the statistics, but it's interesting that if one looks purely at, for example, the Russian Navy's fleets of frigates, destroyers and corvettes and submarines, the Russian fleet is 419 vessels. The UK is 12, plus 2 aircraft carriers. When it comes to submarine fleets, the Russian fleet is 64 submarine strong, and the UK has 6 with 4 nuclear-armed submarines. Our forces are very, very small by comparison, and the assumption has always been that the mass will be available through NATO. But NATO in Europe is in pretty much the same position. So if you add up all of the European NATO capability, in destroyers and frigates, for example, it's 115. I remind you the Russian figure is 419, 4 times the size, almost. In submarine fleets, NATO together actually exceeds the size of the Russian fleet. And why do I mention particularly fleets? Because the threat, the imminent threat to the United Kingdom, comes from the air and from the sea, less so from land. And I think the argument about NATO providing that, mass has often been with reference to the land environment, not actually at sea, particularly the Arctic and North Atlantic, which is an area of responsibility which I don't think Britain can ask anyone else to really step up to. It's our responsibility. I hope that answers your initial part of the question.
Yeah, part of that is one of the questions that we've long asked on this committee again, and it sort of follows on from that point, it is one of resilience. So the ability to take losses. And I think those figures you just described show that's not going to happen.
Correct. I mean, of course, for me, the baseline is always something like the Falklands.
So if you take, for instance, our aircraft,
Yeah.
our fighter aircraft, just for example, in terms of the ability to take losses there is pretty difficult, isn't it?
Well, you're right. And, what we're moving towards an era, of course, of more uncrewed systems.
Yeah.
So the argument that we can afford to lose the metal, what we don't want to lose are the personnel. Of course, that's crucial. But if the baseline was, say, the Falklands conflict, the last time we had an air, sea, and amphibious serious engagement with a medium-sized power, that was very serious. And proportionally, if you superimpose those losses on the United Kingdom, the immediate problem, apart from the tragedy of loss, is how do you regenerate the force? How do you actually replace what you've just lost? Now, of course, in the case of the Falklands conflict, where we had a lack of sea lift capability, we commandeered civilian vessels, and indeed we were able to utilise other NATO partners' intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance and space assets. Norway, for example, provided crucial space intelligence photography, believe it or not, and so did the United States. So regeneration is part of your resilience capability. It's not just what you have on day one. And I think, again, my key message is that the UK is falling far short of its claimed leadership position. And if it wants to actually defend its NATO partners in Europe and indeed in Canada and the United States, it simply doesn't have the mass, let alone the munitions at the moment, to do the job.
We've very clear, the Labour government's been very clear that it's NATO first. Yeah. So in terms of the SDR, and on the background that it's NATO first, what were the top 3 things you think it should address in terms of capability? Oh, you can say 4, whatever, but a small.
Yeah.
You can just give us your top list.
Well, given that the priority threat for the United Kingdom and the special thing that the UK can provide to its European partners is in the air and maritime environment, it seems to me that should be first on our list of what we provide in terms of military capability. So I would suggest that if we go back to our history, back to 1990, the Royal Navy could muster 50 surface combatant warships. 50. Today it's 12, plus 2 aircraft carriers. We are a long way short of that priority area. Anti-submarine warfare. The UK's got a very good anti-submarine warfare capability, but given the number of vessels it can put to sea at the moment in any one working week, and the sheer scale of the North Atlantic, one is left wondering, quite whether that's adequate. We have restored our maritime patrol aircraft for that surveillance capability, but again, I would simply suggest, have we got enough of those really? What about electronic warfare equipment for both sea and air, and indeed on land? The density that we possess is well short, again, of I think what military analysts would say is the absolute minimum requirement. We were a long way short of that too. So those would be my first ones. But I think later on we'll talk about it, but I think the second area would be about our own national resilience in terms of our ability to withstand a sort of sub-threshold series of crises. Second area would be a minor conflict involving a European ally, and the third area would be a full Article 5. In all 3 areas at the moment, we'll be struggling. We can manage the first one, the sub-threshold threats and the crisis. But I think any of the others, we don't have the capabilities that we require. So we need to start thinking about our national resilience, I think, as my secondary priority.
We'll come on to national resilience afterwards.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. On to Mike Martin, please.
Thanks, Chair. Dr. Johnson, if the UK had to fight tonight against a peer adversary, what would go out the door and how long would it last?
Okay, so I'm going to talk in slightly oblique terms as opposed to anything remotely sensitive. That's the case all right. But one of the ideas that we've had in NATO for a long time is the so-called full 30s concept. 30 days to get 30 squadrons or 30 battalions, 30 warships in the area that is under threat. But the reality is that the UK has got a very small rapid reaction capability. We could probably put 2,000 troops, land forces, into the field of operations quite quickly, thanks to 60 Assault Brigade and our global commandos. To mobilise the next echelon there will take a little bit more time. And I say that the latest standard is 30 days, but that seems quite slow. If you think about the outstanding force, one does wonder why that's 30 days long. Now, the way that Ministry of Defence deals with that, of course, is to have different echelons or different notice to move, but that requires the government to at least raise the legislative burdens. In terms of the Royal Navy, again, it's on an open source, so I'm not saying that it's not known, but we currently have a significant number, a majority, in fact, of our destroyer fleet and our freighter fleet in either routine maintenance or deep refit.
How many ships? 3?
If you put a gun next to my head, I'd say we can get 2 destroyers to sea. One is already at sea, of course. And in terms of anti-submarine warfare capability, artillery fleet, an aging fleet, I think the figure today, I think it's 3 or 4 of those. But it's very small. And I think in terms of our air capability, again, we have a rapid reaction capability here in the UK in 2 air stations, which is amazing. We can also call on the 3rd if required. But the number of aircraft we put in the sky is relatively small.
30?
Yeah, I think we can manage 30. Again, I don't have the specific numbers in front of me for a daily thing because I'm not.
So no, we're just sort of exploring this. So 2,000 troops, 5 ships, and 30 aircraft. I mean, is there any point in British history that we've ever had such a poor ability to field a fighting force?
Not that I can think of. And as you know, I'm an historian by training. We're on a par with where we were probably in the 1790s, when there was something approaching national panic.
Okay. And so, looking at those 3 domains, and of course space and cyber we do okay in, space we significantly underperform, and we've sort of discussed the 3 physical domains. We have a strategic defence review coming out. Where would you put the balance of investment effort across those 5 domains?
Absolutely. Okay, so I should declare, if anyone doesn't know, I was a soldier once upon a time. But the priority has to be the imminence of threat. And as I say, for me, the air-maritime threat is pretty urgent because it affects our critical national infrastructure, seabed security, for example, our airspace. There's a great deal of threat now, of course, comes from drones, which have a much longer range now than they ever did even 5 years ago. So we don't have a counter-drone capability or integrated air and missile defence capability, in my mind, which is sufficient. The next area would indeed be, as you've mentioned, space, because if there's going to be even a limited conflict in the next few years, it will almost certainly begin with space manoeuvre. Russia and China both possess manoeuvrable space vehicles with the ability to defeat satellites, not necessarily by destroying with anti-satellite missile systems, which are known to produce lots of debris. And I'm conscious I have a space expert behind me who I look forward to hearing later. But it seems to me that the space capability is very important. Then you're going to think next about the next layer down, which is going to be how secure is our government continuity, public information, in a moment where we would come under very, very severe pressure very, very quickly.
And final question, please. You mentioned that actually we haven't been in this situation since the 1790s, when there was something close to approaching a national panic. Why don't we have a national panic at the moment, and should we have one about this?
I'm not sure panic would be helpful, but I do think that a sober, deep analysis, as you are doing, of what actually happens under 3 different scenarios would be very, very helpful. Part of my job when I was working briefly in Ministry of Defence was net assessment, to examine where the UK has advantages and where, crucially, it has vulnerabilities. And some of the scenarios that I looked at and still do are, first of all, say sub-threshold crisis, so anything short of a war, sabotage, assassination, chemical attack, radiological attack, those kind of things. And we don't need to be necessarily on a very large scale, but it's sufficient scale that would cause serious harm to the public. We have a Civil Contingencies Act in two parts. Part one is about preparation. And in answer to your question, one of the things that I can't quite understand, given what we're seeing around Europe at the moment, what's happened to the UK over the last few years, the fact that Russia makes constant rhetorical reference to wishing to strike against or in a political struggle with the UK, why we've not actually implemented part one. So it doesn't require panic. It requires the implementation of elements of the Civil Contingency Act, part one. Part two then becomes a natural extension of that if there is a crisis, but it means that you are prepared and ready. At the moment, I think there's still a degree of complacency.
Thank you very much.
Right, thank you very much. Ian Room. Calvin Bailey, first of all, please.
Thank you. Very quickly, and not to put words in your mouth, you seem to say that we should focus on maritime and air, and you've spoken about the leading edges of those things, frigates and aircraft. Can you talk about the enabling deficiencies? Because they're areas that we often gloss over, and whilst we could significantly, when we talk about strategic capabilities, AAR, Oilers, those type of enablement things, can you just give us some idea of where we are in terms of shortfalls? Because they tend to be what we bring to the table.
Yes. Well, as you know, the Ministry of Defence will tell you with great enthusiasm about the fact they're investing in solid support vessels for replenishment at sea. My only question about that is how few there are, in fact. And the Royal Fleet of Auxiliary vessels we have, there's only 3 left now, and they're looking a little bit old and tired, although they're crewed in an incredibly dedicated way. I had the opportunity of going aboard one in Bahrain not too long ago, and I'm just amazed how small the crew is and how much smaller they are than the Royal Navy crew, showing that actually we can do more with less if we build the technologies around the crew as opposed to thinking about the costs of things and what we might require there. You're quite right to mention about tankers, for example, air tanking. I think across Europe we're well below where we should be. I was just going to see if I had the figure in front of me, but if the United States follows through with its declared pivot to Asia, which we all expect now, then we are going to be short of those. An F-35 fighter can stay in the air for 2 hours, but then it will need refuelling if it stays aloft. So if you don't have enough of them, you are already impairing your ability to do things. Electronic warfare, mentioned we don't have sufficient density. It's absolutely the case. If you look at even some of the peripheral areas of the conflict in Ukraine, the density is far, far higher than what we have here. Secure communications, we've struggled, particularly tactical secure communications. We don't have those. Our logistics capabilities are better on average than the other European ones, which tend to be unprotected, entirely unprotected. Ours are at least protected, but again, there's insufficient for what we require, which means that in a crisis, we would have to requisition. My question would be, do we have the legislation in place for that? Under the CCA, we might do, part 2, but I'm not entirely certain we have anything approaching what you might call a war plan or a mobilisation scheme to use those. And to give this sort of slightly more colour, rather than the usual colourless lists of numbers, in the UK we have a young technical workforce, better than actually some other nations, to say, in Europe. Do we have a mobilisation scheme for reserved occupations for ICT workers who can help us with that crucial area at the moment of drone development, regeneration of uncrewed systems as a force, or indeed protecting our communications infrastructure? We haven't even begun to address that, in my view.
Thank you very much. Ian Room, please.
Oh, thank you. One word that comes up, Dr. Johnson, in all of these evidence sessions when we're talking about capabilities is interoperability. So I want to ask about NATO integration and interoperability, and it could be said that in the 80s that has sort of dwindled within NATO. So what are the main challenges NATO faces in achieving interoperability?
In a short answer, it's the fact that after 1990, we permitted across Europe and Canada and the United States our defence industries to pursue their own approaches, and we no longer obeyed those standards. We have an absurd situation at the moment where one of the UK Army field guns only takes its own ammunition and doesn't take European standard ammunition. And the Ukrainians pointed that out to us. In fact, I think, if anything, the interoperability problem has been most exposed by the situation in Ukraine. And everyone has, I think, realised with horror just how far down the track we've gone. The question is, to what extent is Europe addressing it? Well, the European Union Commission is quite interested in industry as opposed to providing fighting forces. That might be a start. Perhaps there's a European standard that the European Union can insist on. That would help, I think, everyone. On the other hand, we are probably more likely as a nation to operate alongside the United States at sea and in the air, possibly even on land, and therefore it makes sense for us to think in terms of a NATO standard led by the United States, rather than trying to conform to some European approach. Ideally, of course, you want them all to align, but that requires direction of European businesses and industries to actually then conform to that standard. And there have been some pretty unfortunate episodes where France, for example, has not been entirely transparent about the capabilities of its Rafale aircraft, and that has been detrimental to the whole concept of interoperability. I have to say, as a rejoinder though, at sea and in the air, NATO is far more interoperable than it is in the land environment. The land environment's really the problem, and the Ukraine war has exposed, I say, all of that. But you can fly a French or an American aircraft from the deck of a UK aircraft carrier. That's been mentioned several times. The parts are interchangeable for the F-35, and lots of nations, even in Northern Europe, have F-35As and Bs, which is really, again, very, very helpful. So we're moving in the right direction, but are we going fast enough? I don't think so. If it was a fight tonight situation, as you've mentioned, I don't think we're there, anywhere near that, and we would struggle. It's taken us 3 years to even ramp up the idea of production in 155mm artillery ammunition. 3 years? And to give you the idea about why this really matters, is that Ukraine produced last year 2 million drones. In a month, they used 77,000, but they produced 220,000. I asked around UK industry, how long would it take us to produce 220,000 drones? The answer was 4.5 years. That seems to me utterly unforgivable. And we're all producing different types of drones. Again, an obvious one really, but it needs to be addressed now as a matter of urgency if we're going to get through the next couple of years.
What would your top tip be to the MOD in its procurement?
Make sure that it insists on a SONAC, a NATO standard, that is useful across the whole of the NATO alliance. And I think if Britain leads the way and says we will not procure unless it meets that standard, then I think we're leading by example.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Dr. Johnson, obviously, with regards to lessons from Ukraine with reference to interoperability, it has been a stark lesson for all of us in terms of munitions consumption. It was estimated that Ukraine was using such vast stocks each week in terms of munitions that it was firing, although it was only firing a fifth of what Russia possessed. So there are huge issues, and like you said, they have managed to get different pieces of kit, different equipment from different sources, and yet they have managed to make it work. Do you think that if we were faced with a similar issue, that do we within NATO have that interoperability that we are able to rise to that particular challenge? And what should we be doing to improve things on account of that?
Great question. Well, of course, one of the things that we've always prided ourselves in the UK is that our armed forces are very versatile. And we have been very good at crisis management in the UK. We've got a great track record of crisis management and improvisation as a result. But surely we could do better if we prepare rather than leaving it to the last minute and then improvising at the moment of crisis. That seems to be, a far better idea. I carry with me, actually, at Oxford, Maurice Hankey's little handbook, which he produced before the First World War, but then rewrote after the Second World War, because he was struck by how much his experience of writing preparatory material and getting ready in 1912 had assisted the UK in 1914. And again, of course, in 1938, having those measures implemented meant that we were ready for the crisis when it broke over us in 1940. Just about ready. We almost left it too late even then. So I think the answer is one about preparation. But also, there are lots and lots of lessons that have come out of the conflict in Ukraine, and it's as if they've remained as lessons and not being implemented. Yeah. One senior civil servant said to me a year and a half ago now, I won't name him, in defence, when he was told that there was a requirement to be quite radical with the next defence review. That was the command paper that was done, the command paper refresh of 2023. And he said it would be quite radical, wouldn't it, to actually implement a defence review for a change. And I think he was getting, obviously ironic, but he was getting at something we tend to do in this country, is we've used very good words, but our European colleagues are now looking at us wondering how much more rhetoric can they take without the actual delivery.
Agreed. Well, look, we're hoping that with the Strategic Defence Review that it will be implemented. But look, with regards to senior civil servants, as you've mentioned, there has been a lot of talk. For example, the MOD Permanent Secretary at the recent Public Accounts Committee, he noted that we need to learn the lessons and that now there's a renewed emphasis on the importance of standardisation, of interoperability. Andy Stark, the acting National Armaments Director, he's talked about how we need to sustain the product in the fight if your supply lines are disrupted. Do you think we have what it takes in terms of resilience in the production line? No. With reference to what you've just said with regards to drones and everything else, can we possess that resilience in the production line?
Yes, we can. And one of the things that I would dearly love to see the UK do is to have a rejuvenation of its manufacturing base. There's a correlation between the UK's wealth and success with manufacturing in this country, Midlands, in the north of England and Scotland. And, I can't understand why we took the short route, the easy route of saying, well, we'll offshore it. And now, through globalisation, almost everything we seem to consume in this country is manufactured in China. China had a strategic objective, made in China 2025, it's this year, and they achieved it. And I'm sure every taxpayer at home, laments the fact that if you try and buy British products, they'll have a UK flag on it, and they'll come with "Made in China" written on the bottom. Yeah. If we were to do that, we would build resilience. We'd also be training our technical workforce for the future. We know that defence investment is like infrastructure investment. You don't get an immediate return on investment. And by the way, as a theoretician, I do not believe the fallacy of the so-called guns or butter thesis. It's been proven wrong time and time again that if you invest in defence as you do in infrastructure, you don't get an immediate return, but you get a return much further down the track. And the gross value added that you get out of defence investment is, it depends on how you calculate the figure, but it's significant. It's in the billions of pounds.
Agreed.
But you're generating jobs, regenerating parts of the UK. All those people are being employed. But I think the missing link, since you asked, the missing link really in the whole thing, is that we're still too reliant on the big prime industries because they're the only ones that can make submarines and tanks and so on. Not that we've made tanks since 2004. But I think one of the things we really need to do is embrace what Ukraine has done, and that's take on the small and medium enterprises much, much quicker. But the procurement cycle in this country is notoriously sclerotic and slow, and now we have a policy in place which says that any spend over £50,000 has to be signed off by a 3-star and possibly by a minister, which has actually added to the slowness of the whole system. Really, I have many, many small companies say to me, that they have great ideas, they could implement it tomorrow, they can produce tens of thousands of drones, but they just can't get through the MOD system.
I think you make some very strong points, and you'll have a lot of nodding heads from around the table. I believe Fred Thomas wants to come in on this point.
Thank you, Chair. Dr. Johnson, you've neatly summed up in the past half an hour many of our findings from the last 10 months. And your passion with your frustration about how slow we've been to modernise is palpable and shared by this committee. But you were at the MOD as a director from 2022 until the election was called in May 2024, so last year. And your job there was Director of the Secretary of State's Office of Net Assessment and Challenge. So part of your role, I assume, was challenging Secretary of State. A lot of what we've spoken about refers to those exact same years when your job was challenging the Secretary of State. So my question to you is, was he just not listening?
Did I fail, is what you're asking? Well, there's one of me and a small team that I had, a very dedicated small team behind me, and it wasn't for want of trying, I think is probably the right phrase. But you'll know yourself that even here, the findings of committees and backbench MPs will stand in the Commons, and members of the Lords will stand in the Lords and beg, plead, make their case. But government, as always, is about choice, and they make decisions based on a balance of investments and budgetary demands. And I don't want to sound like I'm special pleading on behalf of defence because I happen to be in it. But you're right to say that things, when defence makes its case, sometimes it has the rug pulled under it in terms of the arguments with the Treasury with number 10, because number 10 or the Treasury will turn around and say, well, you're not very efficient though, are you? You could be better. Why is it, for example, they'll say that Finland has a smaller defence budget than you, but more soldiers? Why has it got more F-35 fighters than you? Now, of course, the argument back will be, well, because Finland's not a nuclear power. Have you seen how expensive a nuclear weapons system is? And very, dedicated crew they are to maintain it. So it's all about balance and choice. But, I would argue that since 1990, we have made a series of choices. Successive governments have made choices on what they're going to invest in. And defence has often been the loser because it was wrongly perceived as not a vote winner. Actually, if you ask the public over the VE Day celebrations, do they think defence matters? Everyone I spoke to said, yes, it does. And they're very conscious, the public at the moment, about the threat posed by Russia and indeed, frankly, by China. So I don't buy that argument. I think the difficulty has been, let's say, at the Treasury number 10 Secretary of State sort of interface, there are choices to be made about where you make those investments and where you spend that money. Defence could be more efficient. We probably need a Doge, probably less ham-fisted, slightly more maybe kind about approaches that it takes, but it probably needs to be made more efficient. Work out, for example, is what we are implementing or what we're using here in defence today, is it making the nation fit to deal with a national crisis? Is it an operator problem? Or is it a regulation problem? And at the moment, we've got the balance wrong. We've far too much regulation and regulators in defence and not enough operators. I'll give you one final example. Again, a senior civil servant, I won't name who, but works in procurement and contracting and so on, said to me that he had found 2 people at the front line working on delivery of a product. But in the system behind them, there were 33 people, including 2 3-stars. And everyone burst out laughing in the room. He said, I don't know why you're laughing. One of those frontline workers has just gone on maternity leave. You've just doubled your inefficiency. Now, it seems to me that we need to take a much more ruthless look at how we are operating more efficiently, to make ourselves more efficient, rather. Then I think there's an argument for going back to the Treasury and saying we should get this right. But internally, I think my senior civil servant colleagues would testify that I was a fierce critical friend.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I believe Derek Twigg wanted to come in here before Jesse Norman.
And I don't disagree with anything you've said there. And I mean, the Secretary of State's on record at this committee saying that the MOD is not fit for purpose. But one of the things, sort of The key issue here is you can be as efficient as you want to be, and I'm sure, as you say, there's many other ways we could save money and spend it better. But there's still the key issue of what we should be spending on defence. Now, I've made it clear my position is that 2.5% is not enough. We should be hitting the 3% before the next election, and we should be going beyond that. So what's your view, just for out of interest to the committee, about what we should be spending on defence to deliver some of the capability gaps, which can all be delivered by efficiency gains? You know.
I've just completed a paper in the last couple of months on defence spending, where it goes, what it should go on, what value added does it bring, and so on. I also looked at the costs of armed conflict. You know, what do they actually cost the nation? So the more you can invest to avoid a conflict, the better it is in the long term for your nation. So the figure, as you know, 59 billion or so at the moment, you know, and it's alleged to be 2.3% of GDP, which of course fluctuates because it's supposed to grow. There's the Balmoral effect, of course, which means that you, if you don't keep up your public spending, it will gradually sink and fall behind. So we're well behind where we should be. The actual figure I think we should spend this year is 3.2% of GDP. That's this year. We should get on with it now. We have the 2.3% we spend, and even if it went to 2.5%, is not sufficient to maintain the current conventional forces. It's just not sufficient. And perhaps members of the MOD will not tell you, but the shortfall is somewhere between 10 and 16 billion pounds. So we need to be spending the 3%. We need to get to 68 to 70 billion pounds a year spending on defence, and we need to do that for sustained for 2 years, just to get us back to where I think we should be. And then we can think about the continuation of modernisation, and what we need is the expansion of the force. I say my priority would be the sort of air, maritime and enablers environment. And it's not to say, by the way, I've been criticised in the past for sort of running down the British Army and not, you know, playing the game as far as they're concerned. Let me just say that as a former soldier, of course I care a great deal about the British Army. 5 combat brigades is far too small as a capability, far too small. We should be aiming for a total of 4 British Army divisions, and I mean square divisions. 2 of them should be armoured and regular, with probably 2 of them made up of reservists. That would be a serious deterrent to any opponent, but I'm afraid 5 brigades is not a deterrent.
Thank you very much. Moving on to Jesse Norman, please.
Thanks very much. Dr. Johnson, very interesting what you've said. Can I just test it quickly in relation to one thing? So you've talked about SMEs. Of course, the problem with a lot of what we're seeing in procurement is that it seems to be impossible, not just the big procurements, but just rapid iteration. But in areas like drones, rapid iteration, actually even more than scale, is what's essentially required. So the numbers don't have to be very large. You might be talking 50 to 100 million quid to give the right kind of demand signal. There's an enormous number of companies, domestic and outside, that could potentially react to that. What's the solution, and how do we get there?
That's an excellent question and a great point. You're absolutely right that there's a famous line in the Bible: those who survive on the battlefield are the quick and the dead. If you're quick to adapt, you will survive. And when UK armed forces go into a conflict, they go in with one thing. By the end of the conflict, they look very, very different, as Ukraine has obviously itself found out. So we are very lucky in the UK. We have a very educated technical workforce on the whole. I think we have the capacity to do it. We've got this brilliant spirit of invention and innovation in the UK, but I'm not convinced that we invest in it the right way. There's been various ideas I've seen floating around Europe at the moment about a European rearmament bank idea, which I think is fascinating. There's all sorts of initiatives like Diana, as they call it, in Europe for innovation. It's not actually delivering a lot at the moment. And we've talked about the equivalent in the UK, Defence Innovation Fund and so on. But somehow there's a sort of vortex effect that it takes it towards the primes because they're the ones with the personnel in large numbers to do things. That said, I have to say, on the edge of some of the primes, we do also, though, have a very good innovation culture. And without naming particular names, I mean, it's really fascinating to go and visit them and see some of the amazing things they've done and how they've bought up some small SMEs and simply brought them into the umbrella of their own company because they can see the talent. So I think it is a question of creating the right system, the right envelope, the right governance structure to allow that natural environment to flourish. And that's all about incentives. At the moment, I just feel we don't incentivise it. And again, I can give you one example. A small company on the Oxfordshire-Wiltshire border, they make drones. They also make high-end motorcycles. They make, kind of paragliders that you can sort of direct in different ways. And they're an extraordinary company. But they told me that they found by accident the requirement for a Royal Navy dual-rotor drone underneath curtains for an RAF officer's mess in this long, long list of procurement requirements. They are a small company. They don't have time to go through all these different systems to find how to get there, and the endless paperwork and the endless delays to contracting. Two small companies that tried to work with me on AI development so that we could exploit that and I could reduce the size of my team, unfortunately went to the wall because the procurement system kept going back to the beginning, kept defaulting to the start point. So we're not incentivising, we're not governing it properly. We have a system that doesn't actually work in that way. And I know the committee has addressed this problem before. And I think that report, by the way, is excellent that was produced in this committee. I would suggest that we now need to see the delivery of that rather than more rhetoric and another report. The SDR must surely address those issues.
Definitely. Thank you very much. I believe Alex Baker also wanted to come in on this point.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson. It was interesting you just mentioning the idea of a rearmament bank, and that is something that this committee is interested in, and something that I have been particularly looking at, the opportunity for a multilateral bank. So I just wondered whether you could talk about, what you think the opportunities are to work with our allies in terms of cooperating to get to the place we need in terms of the capabilities we need.
So in concept, it sounds great. And the idea of a commonwealth, here we are, in Parliament, is a wonderful idea and it's great. The devil, of course, is always in the detail. How do you actually orchestrate and implement it? Because if, let's say, a French defence company was in receipt of some European rearmament bank funding and got a commercial advantage as a result, how do we think other companies, particularly in the UK, would feel about that? The other was the difficulty is distribution and fairness and prioritisation. Again, it comes down to incentives. So I think, it's down to government, particularly defence, to make itself very, very clear about what it requires. I think it could also do a lot of good by developing long-term relationships with certain companies. But within that long-term relationship, it's got to demand a faster cycle of development. And it's got to incentivise that. There are classic examples. A friend of mine who works in Deloitte told me an amazing example of a particular aircraft in the United States, which always seems to spend its time in maintenance and very little time in the air. And so the US government changed the incentive structure, said the longer it's in maintenance, the more money you as a company will lose. The more flying hours it does, the more we'll pay you. Suddenly, those aircraft were in the sky almost all of the time. What a surprise. So it seems to me that that's the route to take with your banking idea, is you've got to get the incentives right and not allow special privileges and favours. And certain countries will feel, there'll be some countries feeling that others are getting all the benefits. So that's very difficult to orchestrate. Yeah. And as we know from combined projects, German labour unions, can hold up, develop certain fuselages because it doesn't suit them. The Spanish will sort of take longer over an aircraft wing, again, because they want the business. So doing combined projects is always very, very difficult, and it requires very strong governance structures.
Thank you very much. Right, let's move on to a completely different aspect, namely the Article 3 of the NATO Treaty. And to kick us off on that, Kelvin Bailey, please.
Thanks very much. We'll give you a moment to replenish your water, Dr. Johnson, and also the opportunity just to familiarise those unfamiliar with Article 3. So Article 3 talks about means of continuous and effective self-help and mutual aid, and the ability to maintain and develop our individual and collective capacity to resist armed attacks. So this is not just about the military, this is about the entire nation. being robust enough and resilient enough to resist attacks of various types. So you've made the case that the UK's defence spending is insufficient to ensure deterrence or fight a peer adversary to a standstill, and that strategic culture and must shift towards readiness. You've pointed to our paper, which highlighted that readiness is a significant challenge. So to begin, in your view, is the UK currently doing enough to meet its Article 3 obligations to maintain and develop capacity to resist armed attack?
It's working towards the objective, shall we say. I'm being sort of diplomatic for a reason. I mentioned earlier today we've had a Civil Contingencies Act Part 1 and Part 2, and that's good. We have an ability to react rapidly and successfully to a crisis. We learnt a great deal from, for example, the 7/7 attacks. We learnt a great deal also from COVID, but I don't think we've actually necessarily institutionalised, if that's the right word, a lot of the findings of that particular crisis. Sorry, you want to come back?
So with that, that's a very good example. So the COVID example perhaps highlights that's national resilient writ large, right? So there are a number of things that if you could just elaborate on. Firstly, the government structures, because national resilience isn't just about defence. Your comments earlier about the size or the amount of defence spending that we would have to grow to in order to meet our Article 3 commitments. Where do you think that should be placed in government? And using perhaps COVID as a lesson, do you think our government structures, such as Cabinet Office or other government departments, feel or understand or share their commitment to meet our NATO 3 responsibilities?
I can't speak for members of the Cabinet Office because I never worked in it, but I did interact with people there quite a lot. And there was a moment where we ran in the Ministry of Defence a war game, as they call it, a simulation of an armed attack on the United Kingdom to find out what would happen. And we brought all the government agencies and we brought the local government officials to come and help us as well. And there's quite a strong representation from the MOD. And I have to say that the Cabinet Office were less than enthusiastic about Defence running the exercise because they felt that this was probably their area. But at the end of the process, they told us that by November of 2024, they would have a plan. And I did notice that there is a website page dedicated to what to do in the event of emergency for the public. The problem is that in the event of an emergency for the public, the first thing you're probably going to lose is your electricity and therefore your ability, I suspect, to read a website. So there's a problem there. There have been some good things done in terms of, the phone alert system, which we tested only relatively recently, which I think is great. We've got some things that we're doing, and there's a Cabinet Office interest in that. I say we have a Civil Contingencies Act, which is also progress. However, I'm not entirely convinced that we know who is in charge of what and how to coordinate the various different problems we face if we had a particular type of threat. So, for example, if it's a distributed denial of service attack, cyber attack, well, I think we know that that's going to be GCHQ in Cheltenham who's going to probably lead on it. If it's an assassination of a leading figure, public figure, I suspect that'll be a police matter, of course, and the Home Office will lead on it. But what if it's more serious than that, a more large scale, rather than, say, one city, like a large terrorist attack in one place? What then? Personally, I'd like to see a dedicated Homeland Security team headed up by a minister. I think that would be important. And it doesn't need to be, everyone always says in government, well, you can have a certain number of cabinet ministers, and what about the budget and so on. You just need to have some sort of secretariat whose responsibility is to know what to do when. And all these things need to be exercised and rehearsed. We were not rehearsed for COVID. We are rehearsed for large-scale terrorist attacks because we've been used to them over 30 or more years. So we know what to do in that occasion.
Okay, but do you see adequate evidence that we're resourced for them? So both of those examples require an amount of additional capacity within the system. And the question I was asking is, for example, has the NHS resourced for Article 3?
No.
Is there adequate evidence that any of the departments have resourced any of their services to meet Article 3?
Not resourced, no. There is information. For example, Thames Valley Police have, a plan of what to do in the event of a chemical attack, which is, incredible because a lot of other forces around the country don't have that. But it seems to me that we haven't resourced these things. And again, I go back to my earlier point. It's always a balance, of course, because a special interest like me might say, well, of course, what you need is a proper civil defence force. And yes, I do think that. I do think we need a force of white helmets. Because if there was a really big national crisis, it's not so much it's going to be military aid to the civil authority, which we've got used to. It's going to be the other way around. It'll be civil aid to the military authority. We're going to have, normally we have, every time there's a national crisis, about 500,000 people come forward, brilliant, dedicated members of the public, to say, how can I help?
We're going to move on to societal resilience. I just want to make sure that we don't veer into the next... and I'm also mindful of the fact that time is defeating us.
Yes, of course.
But thank you very much for that. If I can now ask my colleague Emma Liu, please, to come in on that.
Good morning, Dr. Johnson. Just keeping on the theme of Homeland and National Defence plans. So what is there one in existence at the moment? Do we have a National Defence Homeland plan?
Not that I know of.
No. Okay, so we've been told that there's one being drawn up, but there's reports that it might never be released, the public might never see it, don't even if this committee would ever see it. Are you aware of any ongoing work or a timeline?
I was told, the last time I was told that work was underway was summer of 2024, as I left my secondment to the MOD. I've not had any information about it since, so I can't comment on that.
Okay, and in terms of societal resilience, do we have enough in the UK? I mean, we visit, this committee visits lots of different countries, we've been to Finland and other places, and they seem to have a completely different mindset, obviously because of the geography of where they are. But, you read reports that some young Brits would not be prepared to take up arms to fight for their country. I think the last report said 11%. I mean, how do you shift that dial in our society and in the mindset? I know you said through VED, people were saying, they see the value of defence, but that was probably in the moment. If you say to somebody, well, would you rather that was spent on the defence or the NHS, they'd probably say the NHS.
Yes.
So how do we shift that dial with people?
Well, I think it's down to our own public information and education. It seems to me that we could do a lot of very, very good things about helping our school children and our students of this country better understand about security for them in the round. We already tell them about cyberbullying and we tell them about cybersecurity. But, why not about their own national community and how to help your national community, what you can do with that. We've got such a wonderful voluntary tradition in the UK. It seems to be almost criminal to neglect it in that way. And I'm not advocating a security state and all that. God forbid we should ever go that far. But you can raise consciousness. You could make a reservist force bigger and move not towards a full nation in arms, because again, I don't think we need that. And we'll always want dedicated professionals, but we could do with a much stronger reservist cadre. Proportionally, we're having one of the smallest reservist cadres of people across Europe, proportionally to the size of the nation, one of the smallest. And that does seem very odd to me, maybe because we're an island, perhaps we've become complacent that way.
Who do you think, just touching on some of what my colleague Calvin said, who should be responsible for this in government?
Well, you do need to have it as a centralised mechanism. So I think Lord Sedwell, some years ago, provided an exemplary example of how you might think about fusion or integration of the different arms of government to deal with security threats of all species. Since then, I feel that we've sort of rather let that go. We've neglected it, and we need to rejuvenate that through a central figure with a Cabinet Office team that can really, really help. Again, I've not been a member of the Cabinet Office team, so I don't know specifically what their thinking is at the moment today. Perhaps they've got lessons they've learned from Ukraine that could really help. I'd ask them that question personally. But I do think what I can tell you is we need it. We need a system. for it. We need the governance for it, because the government and business continuity is priority one. You then need a public information system. And thirdly, we then need to answer your question about resilience, how resilient really are we, is a critical national infrastructure repair plan. We can't just leave it to the private sector, because very quickly they will run out of what they need. And when you think about the import of chemicals in the UK, our entire water supply depends on the import of chemicals. If that was interdicted in some way, we can't survive as a nation. So it's not just foodstuffs and raw materials, it's everything that we bring in by sea.
And just in terms of the actual, if you have a national defence plan and it's not getting published, no one sees it, what's the point? If how can people get behind it? So
100% agree with you.
You
need a public-facing one.
Yeah.
And then you probably need a more classified one of the things that are really, really sensitive, like core communications and so on. Fine. But I do think a better outward-facing one would be advisable.
Thank you very much. Michelle Scroggle, please.
Thank you. You touched briefly on COVID, and I think that escalated people's thoughts on just how unprepared we are. Obviously, we saw the lack of supplies in the NHS, but particularly in Cumbrian rural areas, which is my patch, that rurality and the difficulty within the community was raised during that in particular. And I think everybody automatically assumes that it's government or local authority that would automatically be picking it up. There was nobody there doing anything in those first weeks. And it was the local community groups that got together to do all of that. And as you referred to, our third sector. Where is the connection? Where do you see that being fixed? Because even now, we're many, many years down the line and nobody has picked up on that to deliver something should that happen. So we talk about defence, but this is about society and how they react to it, not military and dealing with that, but just the natural things in society, looking after the most vulnerable, those connections that we don't seem to have connected.
Yeah, so an excellent point. I totally agree with you. It's all very well having a sort of central government apparatus, but you've got to have local government involved, and then from there you spread out to sort of local communities. And if you look at parish councils and borough councils and city councils, it seems to me we have a ready-made system. We just need to equip them with the information they need, and then a degree of resourcing. And how often we hear local government complain they don't have the resources even for the services they've currently got. So there's always a trade-off, and there's got to be choices made. But at least, the way we've dealt with first aid, for example, in the UK, is that we have wonderful voluntary services like Red Cross and St John's Ambulance. Why not do the same thing in the UK for a wider resilience programme? It gives people confidence, and then you don't have the panic. You have this sort of sense of national purpose and collective responsibility and a degree of wanting to volunteer to do more.
Thank you very much. And I know time is fast defeating us, but just very briefly at the end, Mike Martin wanted to come in on this particular point as well.
Thanks. It was actually something you said earlier about the war game, simulating an attack on the United Kingdom. What was the outcome? Did they win?
Actually, believe it or not, the outcome is classified. Because I can't talk about that outcome. However, there is a podcast coming up that will be released next month, which will tell you about a non-military one that we did, and I think you'll enjoy it.
Thank you very much. Dr. Johnson, thank you very much for giving evidence today. I'm going to briefly suspend today's hearing in order that we can make preparations for our second panel. Order.
Much indeed.
Yep.
Not feather.
Yeah, go for it. If you just move the, I'm not being petty, The official president of the department, it's got the mayor.
Normal, not someone who has powers or anything.
Like North East Mayor,
okay.
me,
See that
North East Mayor, Chamber of Commerce, and the
Should
court.
have had
I literally worked my arse
This is
off on this
typical
deal.
problem moment, just ignore it.
Guys, if we can get seated, and are we okay? Alastair, Ken? Everything? Yeah? Right. Ian, we're starting off with yourself. Order. I call to order today's Defence Committee evidence session on UK's contribution to European security. And now we have our second panel for today. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Dr. Alastair McGibbon, who is the head of Semiconductors at Spaceforge Limited. Also very, very pleased that we have with us Mr. Ken Turley, who is the former CEO of our UK Advanced Systems Limited. Thank you very much, gentlemen. And our second panel is going to be around SMEs. So to kickstart us, we have Ian Roon, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for coming today. Basically, our SMEs play a vital role in defence, and the CDS has said there's something around 8,000 to 9,000 SMEs, although the MOD in their published material said there's something around 12,000 SMEs with 40 primes around on average. And the intention was by the previous government that we should spend at least 25% on the budget with SMEs, although I do know in recent years that has dwindled slightly in the official figures that are available to us today. I just want to get some sense to start the inquiry off into some context. Could you tell me, how do SMEs contribute to the UK's defence, resilience and readiness, and the deterrence posture?
So thanks for the question, and thanks for the opportunity to speak before the committee. Currently, I would say that the reality is that SMEs are not adding to the resilience of the UK, because the vast majority of business, as you've mentioned, the indirect spend and the direct spend, the indirect spend with SMEs is in the 20% through prime contractors. The direct spend is less than 4%, most of which is in the special forces sector. So to ask the question of how are SMEs helping the resilience with a 4% direct spend, it's not a good answer. And I genuinely believe that the contract values that SMEs see are low, and the longevity causes that problem that they just can't invest. And therefore, my sort of short answer is it's not good news. Could it be better if we were to go to war? And I think the previous panel that you had brought up some really valid points. When we have gone to war, it is the SME community that stands up. So in the requirement of it's hit the fan, then your SME community will stand up and will deliver. And I think it was mentioned before. We go into war with a particular posture, a particular way of fighting a war, which is typically totally nonsensical and non-purposeful for the war it's going into, and we come out of that war with a different way. So, again, repeating myself, I don't think we are helping with the resilience in the short term, but I think in the hour of need, then your SME market or your SME businesses are where the help will come.
Do you want to add to that?
So in our case, we can talk specifically about what we do. So we are looking at in-space manufacturing, but effectively we're a semiconductor company. We fill gaps in the semiconductor supply chain that are currently exist today in the UK. So as an SME would provide, there's a lot of SMEs around that can provide significant innovation, which you can't necessarily get in existing prime-led supply chains. And there's also, if you're looking at resilience, then there's specific gaps of capability that that came up earlier, that COVID found out, particularly in the semiconductor sector, just how many gaps there were in the UK. So we are one of these companies that are looking to plug those gaps. But we'd say it's aspirational because it's certainly, take the point, it's difficult for an SME to readily engage into the UK supply chain. And in some cases because we're an innovative, because sometimes there can be an inertia in existing supply chains. But yes, absolutely a potential contributor.
At the beginning of March, obviously the MOD procurement announced the start of an SME hub. And what would you particularly like to see around the defence industrial strategy regarding support for SMEs, and how do you see and how do you want that to develop?
Well, from our perspective, we'd certainly welcome the SME hub. I mean,
We'll come on to the SME hub later on. I just want to hold that particular thought because one of my other colleagues will be coming on to that. Okay. Is there anything else that...
If you could say something about the defence industrial strategy and how you want to see that develop.
Well, certainly the defence industrial strategy, there's clear technology gaps, which I think SMEs can fill. So if there's if the strategy is clear about how SMEs, recognising there are gaps that SMEs can fill, how can that be done? If there's a role, it's got to be much easier for SMEs to engage than it currently is. And there's certainly things are going in the right direction. We have lots of good conversations with the defence community, but that doesn't necessarily turn itself into tangible results. So ways that you can then convert that into actual action relatively quickly as well, because we've certainly had issues around the speed of engagement in MOD programmes in relation to other types of investment that we can get. So something that oils the wheels to be able to make that much easier for SMEs to engage should be built into the strategy.
Mm-hmm. I think I'd just add that I'd like to hope that we've confirmed the question we're trying to answer. Because as I mentioned earlier, going into conflict, we came out of the Falklands, we learned to fight differently. We went to Iraq and Afghanistan, we learned to fight differently. Now we think the answer is 155mm shells. Is that going to be the next war in Europe? We don't know. So I think to your earlier questions of where are we going to be spending money and how should we spend it, that's what I'm hoping that we've asked that question at the start of the process, which I'm sure you have. It's not in the public domain at the moment.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you much. Fred Thomas, please.
Thank you, Chair. Look, we have this conversation in the context of upcoming SDR, Defence Industrial Strategy. Even today, the Secretary of State is at the London Stock Exchange announcing, we assume, something to do with access to marketplace, etc. We all, on this committee, will have conversations with SMEs and folks like yourselves about the barriers to progression in the UK defence market. What do you think are the barriers for, if you would put yourself in the MOD's shoes for a second, and you're in that building now, what do you think the barriers are for them when they come across an SME whose product they know would have good effect in the UK Armed Forces? What do you think stops them from being able to give that SME a long-term contract and to adopt that technology and capability into the UK Armed Forces?
So commercial regulation, in a nutshell. I'll give you an example. I attend many briefings, as you would expect, of what's going on in the defence world, especially around specific programmes. They all follow a pretty similar format. The General will stand up, say how enthused he is, how he's got money, and how things are going to happen. The 2-star, down to the 1-star, will then stand up and say, we're really after getting after it. We want to engage with SMEs differently. We're really into it. The SO1 stands up. He's actually going to do the work. They're all completely knitted together. They understand exactly what they need to do and what equipment they need. And then the commercial guy gets up and the energy sinks out of the room. And so do 4 or 5 companies who have realised that the commercial guy stands up and says, actually, I cannot engage with SMEs in this programme because a typical programme will have 90, 100 line items and they want to engage with 1 or 2 organisations.
By commercial guy, you mean commercial civil servant officer?
Correct, yes, sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think the process is difficult as well because of all those different commercial arrangements. I mean, I can give you an example. We were successful in some MOD funding a couple of years ago. It was about 200-300k. That took 2 years and 8 stages to get to that point. And in the meantime, we were talking to the NATO Investment Fund for direct and non-dilutive investment, and we got 20 times that amount of investment in half the time.
From the NATO Investment Fund?
Yeah. So it's all these barriers that are just stage after stage to do due diligence, but equally you can do due diligence at the level of millions and very thoroughly.
Yeah.
So there are ways to, there should be ways to make that much more streamlined and a simpler process for, if you know you need the technology, then there's got to be better ways of engaging.
Okay. So you mentioned the NATO Investment Fund. NATO have had a number of schemes to try and encourage tech innovation and particularly take up within NATO forces. NATO Innovation Fund, NATO Diana, which are both came from the NATO Innovation Cell, the former head of which is campaigning for years now for some kind of European Mutual Development Bank that we spoke about before. Within the UK already, we've got the British Business Bank, subsidiary of which is NSIF, which already does some investment and fundraise for defence, intelligence, kind of architecture companies. Do you think a bigger problem for SMEs is access to finance or adoption in the MOD of the actual product? What's the bigger challenge? And you can't say both, by the way, you've got to choose one.
Well, in our specific experience, we've managed to, we've been successful with both the NATO Investment Fund and NSIF. So we're one of the few companies that have actually been able to get investment from both. We've not engaged as easily with MOD.
So I would, interestingly, we had a conversation just before coming in. My experience with NATO is completely the opposite to Alastair's. That it's been, for 12 years, I've been batting on the door to try and find some money to help investment, and have just never managed to find the way. There is a security problem, which I'm sure is going to be a question later on as well, which is replicated in the UK, which I'll come to later when that question is raised. But I've found, so MOD understand what equipment they want to fight the war that they are going to fight. They are restricted from buying that equipment, actively restricted from solutioneering and saying, I've seen this kit in America, that's what we should have, or a variant of that we should have here. That's what the warfighter wants to do. And I'll come back to my commercial civil servant guy who says, yeah, you can't get involved now. Tell us what you want, we'll design it, and then we'll deliver it. That is a far bigger problem than finance in the UK.
Okay, that's really interesting that both of you have highlighted that. It's within the MOD rather than access to finance. Can I ask, in the last few months, there have been quite a few initiatives announced or hinted at from the government. Of course, there's going to be loads more, as I just alluded to earlier. There'll probably be stuff today. What excites you most about what's changing in the last few months? What do you think is going to have a good effect and achieve the change within the MOD so that they're able to adopt and actually use and give contracts to the right companies?
Can't comment on specific things I've seen, but there's certainly there is definitely a recognition of the need for sovereign capability, and that's good. There are more schemes coming out potentially for, non-dilutive income is important to us. So it's great getting NATO Investment Fund, NSIF, but every time you get dilutive income, you're selling a bit of the farm. So you need to be able to balance that with non-dilutive investment that actually helps you engage in the supply chain and start to fill in the gaps of sovereign capability. So there's more focused ways that SMEs can engage with that, and more access to schemes that helps us to engage in a UK supply chain and in European supply chains as well. To start to, if we've got a gap we believe we can fill a gap in resilience, then the important thing then is developing those industrial supply chains that you can pull that through to an end user.
Okay, thanks. Mr. Turley?
So I think we are starting to look investable as a country in defence. I think last year we were one of the most uninvestable countries in defence. And I speak of somebody who trips around the city regularly. We are looking, most exciting is that somebody is going to spend some money, which would be a great thing in our UK defence world, because they've not spent anything for many years of any significant value other than keeping this fallacy of old equipment because we need to fight tonight. So new investment and spending money is going to be self-fulfilling, and I think that's the most exciting part of what's coming up, as well as the SME direction as well.
Thank you. Right. I believe Kelvin Bailey wanted to come in on this point as well.
Thanks very much. Alastair, you've described how the fragmented landscape, particularly the funding landscape, incentivise the creation of micro companies and really inhibits the ability of us to scale up companies and to fill the market. So two things. Firstly, could you expand on how these structures are limiting you? So could we hear that from you rather than from me? And secondly, the net end of that system that we've created is that companies unable to move beyond these very limited grants run out of a consistent funding stream and sell IP abroad. Would you both comment then afterwards on my assertion then that the UK looks increasingly like an IP farm in strategic technologies, and what are the long-term risks of this model, particularly for defence industrial strategy?
Well, in the UK, obviously primarily part of the UK space and semiconductor industries, and there's very few UK companies of scale in those critical technologies. In a lot of cases, they actually set out to be able to be bought over. Now, we as a company want to scale, but there is significant difficulties in being able to do that because we are an SME of scale. It's a global marketplace we're developing. You're looking at tens to hundreds of millions in the short term for us to be able to get to the level of scale that we need to be able to get to. So, initial low technology readiness level schemes to get companies to start on that. There's plenty of those. It's good to get to that point, but when you get to the point where you need to start to develop and build a manufacturing capability, that becomes much more difficult. There are routes. We ourselves, we're working with the University of Swansea. We've got a world-class semiconductor manufacturing facility, a fab, where we can use that to start to incubate. But again, beyond that, we're going to have to then move into a site to get to the larger scale, and that requires levels of investment, non-dilutive, that don't exist at the moment. And I keep going between dilutive and non-dilutive, because if we get dilutive investment to do it, the vast majority of our investment is non-UK. That then increases the pressure to move somewhere else. We'll get significant US funding, for example.
And briefly, Ms. Turley, on this point as well, please.
So I'd agree with your assertion that we are generating an IP bank. We don't like solutions. We don't like equipment. We like white papers that we can regurgitate 3 or 4 years later. I think I'd raise a point, and I don't know if this is going to be raised later, but in finding financing and funding, the SME classification is challenging. I've spent 12 years in defence. I've worked in a startup as employee number 1. I've worked in a 50 to 70 man company that I scaled and sold, and I've worked in a 200 plus SME, of which there were 32 in the mid-tier company. They all have different challenges and different operating models, and yet for SME funding we have one solution.
Yeah. Thank you. Mike Martin, please.
Really struck by your comments on who you called the commercial guy, these conversations that you have with... So I just wonder, are we recruiting the right kind of person to be the commercial guy? And we're bringing in a national armaments director who is the commercial guy or girl in the system, and what sort of person should that be? So, for example, a civil service background, a military background, or perhaps somebody who actually has done commerce as their day job. And I would use possibly as the example what the Americans did in the Second World War, and the system of market inducement that they created to allow huge numbers of firms to retool and deliver gas masks or whatever it was when previously they've been delivering vacuum cleaners. And are we recruiting the right people for these critical roles in the system?
I think the majority of people come, of course, with the best intention in the world, but they have their rules to follow. And this is what's brought up in the briefings I attend. They don't just stand up and give us all negativity. They're just bringing the reality of the process that they have to go through. There has to be fair competition. They can't have solutioneering from the customer. They have to go out to an open customer. The whole idea of rearmament, you're exactly right. We need to have a different approach. We play commercial like we're at peace.
Would you argue we need to change fair procurement rules in order to rearm?
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely.
Thank you. Right, on to Alex Baker, please.
Thank you, Chair. Hello both. So the majority of UK defence funding for SMEs obviously comes through prime contractors. How symbiotic are these relationships, and could they be improved?
I wrote this down on the train coming down, Alex. I thought there'll be a question about how we engage with primes. And as you probably guessed, I'm going to tell you. Excuse me for reading this because I'll get it wrong, but primes roam the globe like dinosaurs of the Jurassic period. They are a necessity for the current defence ecosystem. And we just hope that they're not coming to their extinction period. I can tell you, the vast majority of SMEs that I talk to and people from this committee who visit SMEs will listen to a horror story of an engagement with a prime. It's not always like that, but it really could be better. And I think it comes down to collaboration. So while I was at RUK, in order to trade well with the MOD, I did a series of ISOs from 9001, 14, 15, 27, and so it went on. And then I decided 44001, the ISO for collaboration, would be really useful, and maybe we could set a framework that could actually be utilised by the MOD of how SMEs interact with mid-tier prime contractors and the whole ecosystem of delivery on a project. So after approaching the fourth prime to support this, and the second frontline command, who all refused because of competition fear, I gave up. But wouldn't it be great if we could actually collaborate together and the primes could be used for what they were potentially intended to bring together that resilience to the first question, where SMEs struggle to have an effect, they should be amplifying that SME through collaboration, not through the threat of loss of IP or down-rolling regulation and STANAGs because they've got rid of their risk. Primes are here as a business. They're here as a commercial business. Their interest is not so much... they have an interest, obviously, with the warfighter, but their main focus is their shareholder and their stakeholders, as is an SME when all said and done. So I won't mention the horror stories, but I think it could be improved, and I think it's a place where government could really help, in particularly in the direct and indirect spend, which currently is not scrutinised as well as it could be. And I won't give you a gut feeling, but it's less. What's being published as the spend with SMEs through primes, I would suggest, is less than is what is being published, significantly less. And wouldn't it be great to do a higher direct spend with SMEs if your frontline commands were given that opportunity to engage and buy the equipment that they needed and wanted to fight the war that they want to fight.
Alastair?
We are engaging with a couple of primes, and that's going well. But in general, there is a inability to be flexible within the primes. So if we're a fast-moving SME that need to be able to work quite quickly and we slot into supply chain, if a prime is in charge of a supply chain, there isn't necessarily a huge amount of movement or innovation within that. It's a lot, it's down to risk, as we were talking about. So it's very difficult. If you've got a novel offering, it's very difficult to break into that supply chain if the prime owns it. Whereas other parts of innovation development in the UK is a more open supply chain collaboration, where the sort of the supply chain chooses itself for what's the best solution. If you start with a prime and they're responsible for that, that could be good from a defence procurement standpoint, but from an innovation standpoint, it can be harder to actually get new ideas in quickly. That's potentially something to think about. But saying that, I mean, there are a couple of some primes we work with are definitely want to innovate, but it's just how do you create those right mechanisms for what is high risk when you bring an SME in with a new idea. You've not got a guaranteed solution because there's a lot to be done to get a particular product proven and working right through the supply chain so it then becomes effective at the end user level, and that needs attention and leeway to understand what those challenges are.
Thank you. So the primes are given targets on what they should do with SMEs. I don't think any of us believe that the way the targets work at the moment are fit for purpose. How would you like those targets to work? The MOD mandating primes. How should that work going forward?
So checking is always a great thing, isn't it? As I say, they're not scrutinised particularly well. I think better scrutiny could definitely be part of where they're at. The primes have a big commercial team. I sat on an organisation called JOSCAR, which is a buying group. We were actually one of the first SMEs invited to be in this buying group of 24 primes at the time. And I was quite taken aback that I wanted to use JOSCAR to find suppliers. I was going to transfer technology to the UK and I needed to be able to make things here. And JOSCAR was perfect for that, big database of 5,500 suppliers. I went to the first meeting and the prime contractors do not use JOSCAR for sourcing suppliers. They use it for providing the SME spend in their projects. So they're using it as an audit tool rather than what it was designed for. So in answer to the question, more scrutiny. Maybe that's an element of part of the SME hub that could be brought together, where that scrutiny could be found, because at the moment I don't believe the numbers.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I believe you want to come in just very briefly.
So cash is key, and so we've been thinking a lot about how we get finance to our defence sector. Obviously, the one thing the primes can do is on their payment terms, and some of the work that I've been doing with my colleague Luke Charters is looking at how we can what we can do to encourage the industry to work better, but we found some SMEs who are being given 120-day payment terms. Could you talk about your experience of how the payment process works and what you think it should look like going forward?
I can't talk in much detail, but certainly the time, a lot of it's in arrears, and the time it takes to, cash flow is obviously very important for an SME. Even the scale of ours, it's you need to be able to have efficient payment. You need to have certainty. It needs to be reasonably clear over a period of time how you're going to receive those payments and how that fits into the way you do that. So certainly, it needs more attention. It needs to be built into how an SME engages with the prime, not just in the payments but also in the terms of IP, because sometimes it's not clear. You're never quite sure what's going to happen to the IP that's being developed within the project, particularly if you're developing a technology which is just one part of a final solution. You know, how does that work? How do you benefit from that in the long term? So, you know, better guide and access for SMEs as they engage with primes, and perhaps with the SME hub, but also just slight touching the point before. SMEs also don't know what they don't know in terms of what primes to work with and who's in them as well. So, you know, if an SME is identified as being important to the supply chain, then some form of guidance on how to engage with the key primes would also be important, because you can spend a lot of time, you know, going down blind alleyways in terms of how you're actually engaging with people.
And that's exactly what ISO 44001 does. It gives you a framework of how you will all cooperate together. You agree then the payment terms, you agree what's important to you, because obviously a prime contractor has a totally different focus to the SME and the supply chain. But the ISO allows you to agree the terms and the important big handfuls that you need to deliver the programme with. Would be great to not have stories of 120 days of payment. My own experience is it's never 30. And you always have to chase it. And the reason is it's typically a small amount of money, and it just goes into a box, and it's some young clerk who's not really focused, you know, and you always have to chase money. You always have to chase money.
Thank you very much. And very briefly, I believe Ian Room wanted to comment on this point.
One thing being on this committee that I've found really exciting, really, as we've gone round on visits and gone to various conferences and exhibitions, is just how much innovation there are in our SMEs. And my question is something alluding to what you were saying earlier, Alastair, is how much of that innovation gets stifled by the primes, i.e., I've been made aware of some small SMEs who have been absolutely top of their game, and they might have only had 10, 15 employees, but have been bought out by the primes and therefore subdued within the bigger system. And in the industry, is that a problem, or to stifle that innovation? I'd just be interested in your thoughts and your experience within that domain.
So I'd agree with that. It comes down to it's tied to the ability to scale, actually. So it might be easier for the prime to acquire that company, and that company might be in a position where it's the easiest thing for them to do is to join with the prime, whereas the better thing might be for the SME to be able to have the ability to keep moving fast and scale. Yes. Yeah. And that ties into many other sort of things we've discussed, but it's another symptom of the problem.
We are seeing a change in thought process from some forward-leaning primes. So they're now starting to invest in like buying 20% of a company rather than 100%. Because the primes recognise as well they can't deal with a 10-man team. You know, if they stand up a project team, it's got 30 or 40 people in it to start with. You have got some primes who are looking, and the typical model is, you know, we'll pay your operating costs for 2 years, and then they're not becoming subsumed into the dinosaur, but allowing that to move forward, which I think is a very positive thing. Would be good to be added to from the committee.
Yeah. Right, just want to bring in Michelle Scroggum there, please.
Thank you, Chair. Obviously, we've heard a lot about SMEs and the challenges that they're facing, gaining access to MOD and different contracts. We have in my patch the nuclear deterrent, and inexplicably we have small SMEs in the same patch that are not in that supply chain. Is this something that you hear often, and how do we deal with that challenge?
Yes, I mean, we live that. It's very difficult to quickly and efficiently get involved in supply chains, and that's I think we've been talking about. I don't know whether this question covers the SME hub, but the idea we have lots of good conversations with the MOD, but those conversations don't necessarily then go particularly far into engagement with primes, engagement into specific projects. We've likened it to, you talk about having multiple doors of access. It does feel like that, but sometimes it's also like trying to push the one door If the as we've discussed in telling our company, if that door has got 200 doorbells, that's not much use either. So if there's a way of actually more efficiently having a single point of contact and something that understands the challenges of SMEs, quite often in these programs you have to shoehorn what you're doing into a particular call requirement for a piece of technology or the way the business works or how it works in the supply chain. Whereas if there was more tailoring of programs to the capability that they want from the SMEs, we're talking to a couple of other European countries about potentially having a European office, and in general we're seeing a greater ability to tailor solutions for, if they want us to be there, they will tailor the solution for us to take part. You see less of that in the UK. It's more trying to fit into specific areas.
And given that the space sector is not solely defence, what are the challenges that you're facing engaging with multiple government departments?
Yes, well, yeah, that is, so we cover space and semiconductors. We cover DCIT, DBT, defence and space sector. So it's very difficult. So there's advantages in being dual use, but the disadvantages is you can be, you can be like pointed in different directions about where to actually go. It's always somebody else that might have the solution. So it's very difficult to actually find a home that will also recognise that you can access other areas. So we're getting there. I mean, we're having good conversations, say, within the semiconductor. There's now a very significant semiconductor capability within DCIT, and they're recognising us as not just being a space company, but being a semiconductor company. But that takes a lot of effort and work to work across multiple people in multiple departments to get to that point.
I think if I can just come in, your question was really around the supply chain problem, and where I've seen in the commercial world more than defence, and certainly deterrent is even more slower and regulated. But where they're missing is they go out, they want to get a supply chain, so they go out looking at the big list of potential suppliers. They funnel them down and they find the 3 to 5 companies that they're going to work with, and that's it. See you in 20 years' time. What they should be doing is refunneling back round and driving a supply chain how you should drive a supply chain, ensuring efficiencies, ensuring the right capabilities, standards and cost. But what they tend to do is they like the rigidity and the safety of, we found out 4 suppliers, we've done all the checks, we know how much money we're going to get in, this is how much we're going to pay out, that 20-year contract is absolutely perfect. So why on earth would we want to talk to another supplier? So it's a failing in the supply chain.
And how would you change that if you could have a magic wand?
I'd insist that the supply chain was reviewed more frequently. I wouldn't, not annually, but maybe 3 to 5 years. You should be looking at the supply chain. You should be looking for efficiencies, and also it keeps your suppliers on their toes, right?
Great. Keeping everybody on our toes. Right, time is fast moving, but I've got quite a few different questions. So, if in your responses you could be as brief, as concise, to the point as possible. Starting off with Emily, please.
Morning both. Just a quick question from me. Is it harder to work with the primes or with the MOD? And to yourself, Dr. McGibbon, is there any other government department that you do work with that is better at this than the MOD?
Oh dear, the answer to this is going to get me in trouble. But,
yeah, be very careful when you answer that one.
We know what the answer is anyway.
Well, our engagement, we do work with a lot of primes, and that, once we get in with the primes, then we'll be able to work well with it. I think the issue with the MOD is lots of conversations in no particular. That I would say the MOD, it's harder working with the MOD than some of the other departments. I would say, from a personal opinion, DCIT, for example, is its main business is working with companies and supply chains, and it tends to be able to be a bit clearer how you work with the mechanisms that they have to encourage innovation. obviously MOD is different. It's not necessarily about innovation, but there needs to be, for it to be robust and resilient, it does need to be able to understand the challenges of getting innovative solutions into products, and that takes a bit, I think.
We increasingly get a sense on this committee that the MOD is organisation and has a culture that's very resistant to change and is very big and unwieldy. So,
yeah. You may say that, yep.
Yeah, I'd echo that. I think it could be fixed, but I do echo it.
Thank you. Kelvin Bailey, I believe, wants to comment on this particular point.
I'll try and keep this clear and focused, but it's just particularly to jump on what Michelle had got to with your ability to access funding. I just wanted a bit more, if anything, on the challenges of presenting a product in the space sector within the UK and understanding where the sustainment of that money comes from, because with a disaggregated and fractured government process, I can't see where the sustaining funding comes from within government. Perhaps that's something you could...
Well, within this, so my main sector is semiconductors, but certainly working, do spend a lot of time in the space sector. I think there's definitely a willingness in the UK space sector to start to be able to grow and sustain companies like ourselves. So I mean, we have good relationships with the UK Space Agency, for example, and they recognise potentially the contribution that we would have to UK sovereign capability and resilience. The issue in many cases is how do you get that funding that helps us do that. In some cases it might actually be at odds with particular, say, ESA and European level funding. So having something which is UK focused helps us, and that we're starting to see that in conversations with the UK Space Agency now that we've been around a while and people understand what we're doing, and it's very new and it's very different. There's starting to be mechanisms and potential funding in place to start to support that. But that we definitely need that. We're looking at several million to tens of millions of pounds of ideally sort of co-investment from government in the technologies we're looking at. And that obviously takes a while to get those mechanisms in place.
Thank you very much. Dr. McGibbon, I interrupted earlier when you were talking about the SME Hub, but this is a perfect opportunity to discuss that and more, which will be taken through by Mr. Jesse Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just as a general characterisation, when we're in peacetime, procedures are slow, impersonal, and highly rule-based. When the guano hits the fan, again, you actually got to make a decision, get on with it. Very quickly, stuff becomes quick, personal, and discretionary. What are the lessons that we can use? Before I turn to the issue of the SMEs, what are the lessons we can learn from that broad characterisation about what we could be doing faster, better, more effectively now?
I think that was covered in the previous session as well. I think there is a reticence from the MOD to change, and that's clear across the piece. But we know the solution. We've done it on a number of occasions. We've been to Afghanistan. We knew how to procure things. We've been buying things for Ukraine for years. We know how to procure when people are given the latitude and they're given the grown-up view of, yes, that's what we want, please go and buy it. The problem in rearmament is cultural as well, that the country is, that there are decisions, there's only so much money. The country is not up for this at all. As far as the country, in my mind, the general public is concerned, we are at peace, Ukraine's a long way away. The fact we've got no anti-missile defence anywhere in the UK is an irrelevance to the bloke down the pub. So I think we know how to do it. I don't think there is a willingness to do it.
Okay, thank you. So just focusing then in on the point you've just made, can you just give me an example of amongst a slew of recent MOD announcements that might be affecting the SME sector, one that filled you with joy because it gave you a sense that they were actually heading in the right direction, and one that filled you with dread because it just reinforced all the worst prejudices we've all had about how slow they are?
So initially, the SME hub filled me with absolute joy. My in-tray was full. Why weren't you in number 10? Because I wasn't invited. But then I start to look into it, and it's a very thin veneer. And then I start to think, oh, maybe it's not quite. Is it going to be another talking shop? That's my concern at the moment. But it was a great piece of news. I think it was exceptionally well presented. And it stopped a lot of questions in the House, I'm sure, of what are you doing for the SMEs, because you have a stock answer. But I'm not fully tied into the solution, because I know there's working groups going on, but I'm just feared that it's going to be another talking shop.
Did you want to comment, Dr. Fitt?
Yeah, well, one thing that's been good recently, particularly from a semiconductor standpoint and UK capability, is there's been a focus on the Ogtrick in the North East, so there's now government involvement directly into the supply chain for semiconductors, and particularly non-silicon semiconductors in the UK, and that's good. I think what's difficult again is any announcement that, I think, say during COVID it was quicker to be able to move, certainly from a semiconductor standpoint. When people realised it took a year to get a car because it was the chip, then suddenly things started to move, and the ability to recognise that. I fear that is being forgotten, and we still need that sense of urgency to develop UK capability in the critical materials that are required for those supply chains. I think earlier this morning we heard about the importance of chemicals. Semiconductors is a chemicals industry, effectively.
Doesn't that require just one very strong-minded human being with enough energy and authority to make the thing happen? I mean, I say this as the husband of the person who ran the vaccine task force.
Absolutely.
So most of these problems could be as simple as that.
Most of these problems can be resolved by just an entrepreneurial business approach to making decisions, and there's a distinct lack of it.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mike Martin, please.
Thanks. So how do we compare to other European countries or other structures like the EU or NATO? Do they also have these problems?
So yes, they all have the problems. I think they're all moving at a considerably faster pace than the UK. So if you look at, from an investment perspective, where are people not investing? It's the UK and Australia, because nobody's getting off the pot and buying anything. If you look at Germany and Holland and France in particular, more so Germany recently, their defence spending, actual spending on equipment for the front line and the defence of their countries has significantly increased. And they are buying electronic warfare equipment, they're buying anti-missile equipment. We're talking about buying it.
Have they changed their structures and processes and personnel and all that sort of stuff?
So
facilitate that speed.
It's a good question, but I think they have been and continue to be not more nationalistic in their approach. So they have one or two prime contractors. You won't see many contracts in Germany that don't have Rheinmetall attached to them, for example.
So, but within the SME space, like how are they doing it, bringing SMEs into the?
So again, if people are buying equipment, then the SME naturally has to fill the supply chain. The prime doesn't typically build and invent stuff. They're fed by SMEs.
So in that sense, it is a kind of prime with SMEs.
Yes, exactly.
A bit like we have now.
Yeah.
But you're saying it's working better than it is here. And why
they're spending more money.
So it's literally just more juice.
Yep. So when we talk about 2.5%, 3%, 3.2%, as was mentioned earlier, on what is the key question that I'm not seeing in the public domain.
Yeah, I think it's back to the point I made earlier. I think we're in our initial engagement with some European countries, it certainly seems easier for an SME for them to be able to tailor what they do to make it easier for us to access national infrastructure and national capability assistance and funding. At a European level, I mean, I don't think necessarily mechanisms like Horizon have changed that much. I think that's still quite a slow way. That's a very long-term way of getting involved. I think access to, I don't know if this is quite in your question, but bilateral funding with other European countries is useful. There's a scheme called Eureka that's been going for years, which is, I think, it's been very good for SMEs because you end up, it's quite close to market, fast moving relatively, near to market. More mechanisms like that between UK and Europe would certainly help engagement as well.
Thank you very much. The House of Commons Defence Committee recently had the pleasure of going to the International Space Show in Farnborough, where we looked at semiconductor production, for example, in space, and lots of other fascinating cutting-edge technologies. And I think we've had some very, very informative evidence sessions as well. And thank you also for your written evidence, which went into a lot of issues. We have covered a considerable amount of ground during this session, but are there any other significant challenges facing our SMEs that you feel haven't been covered? Mr. Turley, you mentioned earlier about the security problem. Perhaps you wanted to elaborate on that, but just for the record, any other significant challenges facing our SMEs before we conclude today's evidence session?
I'll come on to the security. One other thing I'd like to mention is banking. Yeah. I think it was mentioned cash is king. So I've run many businesses, and in the defence world, I had to apply to 19 banks to get an account set up for RUK 3 years ago. And even in that application process, so RUK is owned by Rafael in Israel. Yeah. So you'd think, well, that may be a bit of a factor. We didn't actually tell them at the point that we were getting told they don't want to do business with us. And recently, RUK is looks like it's about to be debanked. As a high street bank has been acquired, and I'm now getting regulatory forms to fill out, the like of which I've never seen in 20 years of having business bank accounts. So that's one I'd just like to put out there.
You said 19 applications.
Yes. Yeah, and that is, by the way, an issue that some of us have taken up. The Defence Committee has heard about this particular issue, and we have raised it directly with the MOD as well. But what about perhaps around the lengthened time, the cost to bid a contract? Do you think that is something else that needs to be looked at?
Of course. Again, it comes around to that commercial regulations. If you look at a recent programme for the ACTS, the Army Collective Training System, large programme, hundreds of millions, still ongoing. I think it's now in its third year of trying to get somewhere. It's run out of competitors. There's nobody now. There was 12 main people. Large companies have pulled out because it's too long, it's too complicated, and the return on investment does not make financial sense.
And Dr. McGibbon?
I think we've sort of touched on it with procurement. The ability, be very important for us to be able to scale, is to be able to win contracts and have access to contracts relatively quickly as well, without with just the proper amount of due diligence, but not overbearing. So the ability to procure solutions that may have risk with them because it is highly innovative, I think that is potentially something to look at.
Just for the record as well, what are your views around security clearances? Because that's an issue that's come up to the likes of myself before as well. But what are your views on security clearances?
I'll take that first, if you like. So the security clearance comes into two aspects. There's the personal security clearances, and then there are the building facility clearances. Yeah. And then how does that affect your commercial proposals? So the rules currently are, if you do not have an FSC, a full security clearance of your building, you cannot receive classified documentation. So if it's a classified project, of which we were doing several, you can't receive the documentation, and therefore you can't bid for the work. So that's a bit of a problem. But then you can't deliver work if you can't win it because you can't bid it.
Precisely. So it's a huge issue for SMEs.
It's a massive issue for SMEs.
Yeah.
The timelines involved, so I've been around this for many years. I hold a high security clearance myself. It took me 15 months to achieve a full security clearance for our building, and another 6 months on top of that to receive the IPSA, which is the personnel security clearance, so that we can actually hold clearances. So SMEs, it's very difficult for them to hold clearances, but also you're not able to bid for work because you're not able to receive the classified documentation. And when I have complained, and I was told how wonderful they were and please don't write back to me, but there are two answers that I got were, one, can you borrow somebody else's facility? Do you have a prime in your area? And the second one was, we will give you a temporary clearance to allow you to receive the documentation. So we tried that 3 times. On all 3 occasions, we ran out of competition time before we were given the clearance to receive the documentation. It is a massive problem. The security authority in the UK is overstretched, underfunded, and it's failing to deliver.
Thank you very much for putting that on the record. That's why I was particularly trying to tease that out. Dr. McGibbon, any final words from yourself? Anything that you feel hasn't been covered in terms of a significant challenge?
No, I think that covers it. The security, I think we've not got that far yet, but certainly the ability there are potential schemes with organisations like HMGCC, for example, where they're looking to at least do challenge-led competitions for companies to engage in. That is potentially a good way of initial engagement with these sorts of organisations for non-security cleared SMEs.
Thank you much. It's been a pleasure to have you here to give evidence, and I think it underlines the importance of SMEs to the defence industry, and that's particularly why the Defence Committee wanted to have this panel, and why we have been focusing in on SMEs, because as was very eloquently highlighted to us previously by Make UK Defence, in that the MOD at the moment seems to be very, very prime focused, and if we carry on in that same endeavour, what that normally leads to is it is one source, one supplier, and then if there is a surge required because of a conflict, that means you only have one factory, one source, and that will represent a huge challenge for us as a nation. But thank you very much for your time today, and with that I call an end to today's session. Order, order.